Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second talk in our department's research seminar. This is the Department of Theoretical Philosophy at the University of Bucharest. And the speaker series is organized jointly with CELFIS. This is the Center for Logic, Philosophy and History of Science at the University of Bucharest, and the CUP. This is the Research Institute at the same university. We're glad to be able to sponsor the speaker series via a project that's supported by UEFISCDI. This is the local public funding agency for research. And the project is a postdoctoral grant that has the following code: PN-3 Roman P1-1-PD-PD-2019-0535. And we're very grateful to our public sponsor. Tonight's speaker is Mona Simion. Professor Simion is coming from the University of Glasgow, and it's absolutely fantastic to have her. I'm excited to hear what she has to say, and her talk is titled "A Puzzle for the Normativity of Inquiry." Mona, please take it away.
Thank you very much. So I'm gonna also start with the project code. So first I'm gonna tell you a bit about this research project that I'm doing now. It's on ERC money. And how the puzzle that I'm going to be talking about today is a bit of a pickle for my project, methodologically speaking. The puzzle was put forth by Jane Friedman, and she calls it a puzzle for the zetetic turn, by which she means a puzzle for anybody who thinks that epistemic norms are norms of inquiry, where zetetic stands for inquiry related. And then I'm going to look at three possible ways out. Some of them have actually been explored by philosophers. Some of them could be taken by philosophers given the general views that they've got. And of course, I'm going to tell you that they're rubbish. And then I'm going to tell you the true view, my solution to the puzzle. So here's the project. It's called Knowledge Lab. That's because it's snappy. What it's actually about is knowledge for social epistemology. No biggie to understand what I'm doing. I'm basically just applying the knowledge first framework that Tim Williamson has developed to social epistemological issues because Tim didn't bother to do so. You know a bit about social epistemology. It's a pretty thriving area of research these days because it's, it's sexy to talk about fake news and conspiracy theories. And the results in this field have wide impact on scientific practice and social and political sciences. And the problem that I notice in this proposal that I submitted to the ERC is that if you look closely at the field, you're going to notice that we have a methodological deadlock. What do I mean by that? Well, we started off doing social epistemology individual first. What do I mean by that? I mean that basically when we started with Alvin Goldman in the 80s, we were just simple-mindedly trying to do it in the same way in which we had done individual epistemology. We were just like before that, we had been thinking about the individual and how the individual can gain knowledge from the surrounding environment. Now we were thinking about how the individual can gain knowledge from the surrounding social environment. So that's the way in which we started thinking about social epistemological issues. And of course, because we started like that, it's not very surprising that we ended up with a very kind of demanding social epistemological pictures, because we thought, well, the physical environment is stable and safe, but the social environment is unstable and unsafe because people can lie, and they will do so when it suits their interests, which often it does. Therefore, we should be much more careful in the social environment than we are in the physical environment. So we should do a lot of detective work. We should check the credentials of all of our testifiers before we believe them. And the problem with this picture, even though, prima facie plausible, so this seems like the kind of thing that your parents would tell you when you're little, don't trust what, strangers tell you and so on. The problem is that it's too demanding, and the result is that it's empirically implausible. How come? Well, most of the knowledge that we have comes from other people because we're, psychologically and physically limited creatures. I can't go and check, the height of the Carpathians myself. Even if I climb them, I'm not going to, have the capacity to actually measure it. So I need to trust my geography teacher on it. I usually actually give the height of the Carpathians when I give this talk. Nobody seems very impressed by it. I thought that I should definitely not do it in this time around. So all of this stuff we get from our teachers, from our parents, from TV, right? Most of our knowledge, because we're very limited. The only things that I know by my own perception right now is that I have a computer in front of me, basically, right? Everything else comes from other people's testimony or memory or other such sources. So if it's so hard to acquire knowledge from other people, in that I need to do detective work every time someone tells me that, you know, I should turn left and for the gas station, then I wouldn't know any of these things. So that's empirically implausible. So then more recently, people like Sandy Goldberg and John Greco and Jennifer Lackey have decided, well, maybe what we should do is, instead of starting with the individual, we should start with the social in analyzing social epistemic interactions. So what these people do is they look at the social environment and they say, well, look, sometimes social environments are epistemically friendly. Sometimes we have these norms of truth telling or knowledge telling or whatever. And, you know, people, there are environments in which people actually do tell the truth and assert knowledgeably. So in these environments, the individuals don't have to do much. They can just trust testifiers on mere say-so. In more complicated epistemic environments, think Gara de Nord, there you need to be careful. If the taxi driver tells you, you know, it's 130 pounds to Victory Square, maybe you should not really trust their word. So that's kind of the picture. And I found this picture very plausible for the longest time. I published myself on this picture. It's also a nice picture because you can use research in social sciences on social norms and how they work, and how in behavioral economics on how social normativity affects people's behavior. So it's a really nice picture. The problem is that it, methodologically speaking, is a failure, in principle failure. And here is why. If you do this, so if you say, well, depending on the social norms of the environment, you can believe people or not, you're basically placing epistemic normativity first. So your social normativity first, right? So your social normativity is going to do the grounding, the normative grounding for epistemic normativity. So what that means is that something is going to be very roughly epistemically good or bad, depending on the social norms at the environment. But that means that you're licensing all kinds of bad social norms, right? There are also epistemically bad social norms. So in sexist societies, we have social norms that say that you shouldn't trust the word of women. In, you know, racist societies, we have social norms that say that you shouldn't trust Black people. And conversely, in most societies, we have the absolutely ridiculous social norms that kind of encourage us to trust people just because they are, I don't know, powerful, or because they are popular. So, you know, we have societies in which you're likely to be encouraged to trust the word of, I don't know, Britney Spears over your geography teacher or something like that. So, you know, these are all bad social norms, bad epistemically, and we don't want these bad social norms to kind of deliver the result that's an epistemically correct behavior, right? But if we place social normativity first, that's exactly what we get, right? So in environments in which it is socially permissible not to believe women, you're going to get epistemic permissibility too, if the social norm is what grounds the epistemic norm. So that's not something that we want. And that's an in-principle problem with this kind of approach. So the upshot is that both methodologies that I've seen leave a vast array of generated epistemic value unexplained, in that the really demanding individual first one leaves all the knowledge that I've got from testimony without doing detective work unexplained. And the other approach leaves all the knowledge that I have, for instance, from women or Black people in sexist and Black and racist societies, unexplained, right? But we know this knowledge exists. We know a lot of things from women and Black people, as it turns out. So how do we explain the fact that we do? So what I do is, instead of starting, as it were, bottom up from the interacting parties, right? So what you get in a social epistemic interaction is, you know, for instance, in testimonial interactions, you get an individual and then the social environment trying to transmit information to this individual. So, you know, what we've seen were two methodologies that were starting here, either here or here, but bottom up, right? Bottom up from the interaction to the knowledge delivered. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to do top down. So I'm starting with the knowledge because I know it's there. We know that it's, you know, a lot of knowledge out there that we get from social epistemic interactions that needs to be explained. And then I'm looking back into how it was generated. So I'm basically checking what social epistemic interactions reliably generate knowledge in our social environment. And when they reliably do so, then by stipulation, they will be normatively right. So that's the methodology. So in more detail, I take knowledge to be the practice of inquiry, generally speaking, and I take social epistemic interactions to be moves in inquiry, like, moving the horse is a moving chess or something like that. And if you think about it like that, you're gonna see that, moves in inquiry in general aim to kind of fulfill the practice, the aim of the practice in question, right? So whenever I move my chess pieces, what am I doing? I'm trying to fulfill the aim of the game of chess. Similarly, I want to say that all epistemic interactions aim to fulfill the goal of the practice. And if that's knowledge, then all epistemic interactions are going to aim at knowledge. So I want to say that just like biological etiological functions generate norms about proper functioning, who are there to ensure that the function is reliably fulfilled. In the same way, social epistemic interactions are governed by epistemic norms that are there to ensure that knowledge, the function of inquiry, is reliably fulfilled. That's roughly the analogy. So the upshot of this entire party is that social epistemic norms are inquiry norms, on my view, right? Because it all derives from the goal of inquiry, which is knowledge. So they are inquiry norms because they are norms that are there to ensure that our moves in inquiry deliver knowledge reliably. So all or zetetic norms, as I said, zetetic norms is the technical term that's vehiculated these days. So here's a puzzle for anybody who thinks that, like I do, that epistemic norms are zetetic norms. The puzzle was put forth by Jane Friedman. So Jane puts forth the following case: the Chrysler building, she dubs it. Say, for instance, that I want to know how many windows the Chrysler building in Manhattan has. I decided the best way to figure this out is to head down there myself and do a count. To do my counting, I set up outside the Grand Central Station. Say it takes me an hour of focused work to get a count done and figure out how many windows that building has. During that hour, there are many other ways in which I could make epistemic gains. There is obviously a huge amount of facts around me that I can come to know. So Friedman thinks, well, here's a paradigmatic zetetic norm of inquiry. If one wants to figure out whether Q, then one ought to take necessary means to figuring out whether Q, right? So if one wants to know how many windows the Chrysler building has, one ought to take the necessary means to find out how many windows the Chrysler building has. And here is, Jane thinks, a paradigmatic epistemic norm. If one is in a position to know a proposition P, then one is permitted to come to know that P. So that, she thinks, is just, garden variety epistemic norm. If you're in a position to know something, you're at least permitted to come to know it. But she thinks in the Chrysler building case, ZIP, so the inquiry norm, and KPA, the garden variety epistemic norm, come into conflict, right? Because ZIP, it tells you that you should go ahead and count those windows because you want to figure out how many there are, while KPA tells you that you're allowed to come to know all of the other facts around you that you are in a position to know. But those two things come in conflict because as soon as you start counting the windows, you can't come to know all the stuff that's happening around you. So furthermore, notice that the Chrysler building case is not even that interesting or odd a case. You can generalize from this to all kinds of inquiry, all inquiry, starting with, fancy scientific inquiry and ending with me trying to figure out if there's still, potatoes in the cupboard. All of these inquiries are going to put me in this kind of normative conflict between what I want to figure out, the norms governing my inquiry, so what I want to figure out, and all the other stuff that I could come to know instead if I weren't, searching for the potatoes. So the puzzle is basically kind of, made out of the following claims. The first one is my commitment, E equals Z, epistemic norms just are zetetic norms, norms of inquiry. The second claim is what we've just seen, easy conflict, zetetic norms and epistemic norms lead to normative conflicts on a large scale. We've just seen that, right, in the Chrysler building case and the generalization. And the third claim is internal harmony. There can be no large-scale normative conflicts within a given normative domain. Right, so the reason why this is a puzzle is because one of these claims need to go. Obviously, they're inconsistent. Of course, obviously, again, you're going to have, in order to get rid of the puzzle, you need to deny one of those, right? So you either deny that epistemic norms are inquiry norms, or you deny that they come in conflict a lot, or you deny that that's a problem. Maybe you want to deny that normative domains are not peppered with normative conflict. So these are the options. So let's try the first option. Again, I don't have that option, right? Because my entire project, a lot of money, rests on the claim that E equals Z. So that's not an option open for me. But other philosophers that didn't sell their soul maybe have this option. Let's see what happens. So if you deny E equals Z, you deny that epistemic norms are zetetic norms, right? So what you do then is you have an individual first approach. That's what you have, right? So Sosa, for instance, has a view like that. He thinks that zetetic norms, i.e. norms as to what questions to take up, pertain to intellectual ethics, not to theory of knowledge proper. So it's one thing, our pure epistemic norms about how to go, about responding to evidence and so on. And it's another thing what we should inquire into. That, according to Sosa, is just intellectual ethics, not epistemology. Thomas Kelly also thinks that epistemology deals with the proper handling of evidence we have, not with norms of gathering evidence. So it's one thing to respond well to evidence that you already have. It's another thing to have to go into the world and gather more. That's not the proper subject of epistemology, according to Kelly. Hawthorne and Srinivasan, although they're talking about something else in that paper, they also end up claiming that one is permitted to suspend on P if one doesn't know that P. They're talking about disagreement in the paper in question. But the point that they're making is, insofar as you don't know, you're free to suspend belief. So whatever you don't inquire into, you don't yet know, obviously, so then there's no problematic conflict. The problem with having this kind of view is that you're going to end up in trouble with a lot of intuitive cases of lack of justification. So take, for instance, a classic sexy scientist case adapted for Jennifer Lackey. Sexy scientist Bill doesn't believe anything his female colleagues say. Suppose Bill carries out 2 experiments to test his hypothesis that P. Experiment 1 strongly supports that P. Experiment 2 strongly supports that non-P. The scientist comes to suspend on P on this basis. Suppose next that a female colleague of his, Anna, discovers a serious flaw with experiment 2, which she points out to Bill. Due to sexist bias, Bill discounts Anna's word and maintains his suspension on P. So intuitively, we want to say that this is a case in which scientist Bill is not justified to maintain his suspension on P, right? Why? Well, it's a paradigmatic case of higher order defeat, right? After Anna's testimony that Q, there is a flaw in experiment. Number 2, Bill's suspension on P is no longer justified. So what does this guy do, the sexy scientist? Well, he does not take up the question as to whether his experiment is flawed, right? So, it's not a question of evidence that he already has, because he doesn't even take up the question as to whether his experiment is flawed, but he should take up this question, right? This is an epistemic should, because if it weren't an epistemic should, it couldn't affect his justification. So non-epistemic norms don't affect people's epistemic justification. Thereby, if we have the intuition that the sexist scientist is not justified in maintaining his suspension on P, there it follows that it's an epistemic norm that affected his justification. But since only epistemic norms proper can affect one's justification, it follows that some inquiry norms are epistemic norms. The inquiry norm that says, inquire into whether experiment 2 is flawed or not. Problem number 2. Consider Dr. X who believes that P, for instance, that stress causes stomach ulcers, but missed a widely known recent development in the field that Q, stomach ulcers are caused by Helicobacter pylori bacteria. X does not justifiably believe that P, right? Q is a defeater for his belief, which undermines X's justification for believing that P. Now, notice that Dr. X, again, doesn't bother to inquire into recent discoveries in the field. So it's not like he has all this evidence lying around on his table and he's a non-responsive to it. It's that he just doesn't bother to inquire into recent discoveries. We want to say that this doctor is not justified to believe that stress causes ulcer, right? We want to fire him because he's not justified to believe that stress causes ulcer. But it turns out that we can't fire him on Ernie Sosa's view or on Tom Kelly's view because he's done his epistemic job on those views, right? So again, the upshot is that some inquiry norms are epistemic norms. All right, so that didn't work well. So that's good news for my project because it follows that I'm right that T equals Z, but I'm still subject to the puzzle. So how about denying easy conflict? So remember, easy conflict was the claim by Jane that there's a lot of, insofar as you believe that inquiry norms are epistemic norms, you're going to get a lot of normative conflict whenever you decide to inquire into a particular question. So what you do when you deny easy conflict, you deny that zetetic norms and epistemic norms lead to normative conflicts on a large scale in the way in which Jane thinks they do. So one way to do this is distinguish norms about inquiry and norms of inquiry. So remember ZIP, right? The paradigmatic zetetic norm that Jane was talking about. If one wants to figure out Q, then one wants to take the necessary means to figuring out Q. ZIP is a norm about inquiry on this picture, not a zetetic norm, not a norm of inquiry. So what does that mean? Well, there are norms about engaging in tennis playing and norms of tennis playing, right? So it might be impolite to engage in tennis playing in the middle of a conversation, for instance, or it might be impolite for me in the middle of the talk to just take out my racket and start playing tennis. That's a norm about tennis playing. I shouldn't do it in the middle of a talk. And there are, of course, norms of tennis playing, right? The norms internal to the domain. Just like tennis, inquiry is a norm-constituted activity, right? So notice that constitutive norms are not desire conditional, right? So while it is according to my desire if I want to take up tennis or not, as soon as I engage in tennis, it doesn't depend on my desire whether the norms in question govern the game. Those norms are fixed because they're constitutive of what it is for a game to be tennis. My desire has absolutely nothing to do with them. No matter how much I want for these norms not to govern the game of tennis, they're going to continue governing it. But if constitutive norms are not desire conditional, it starts looking as though ZIP is not really a constitutive norm of inquiry, because if you look at ZIP, you're going to notice that it is desire conditional, right? It says if one wants to figure out Q, then so and so. So maybe what we need to do is revamp ZIP. Let's see how we could revamp it such that it's not a norm about inquiry anymore, but it's a norm of inquiry. If you are engaging in an inquiry aimed at figuring out Q, then you ought to take the necessary means to figuring out Q. So now ZIP prime or whatever does not have the problem of the desire condition anymore. So of course, because it doesn't have that problem, it's going to deliver Friedman's puzzle revamp all over again. So the puzzle is back. Here it is. ZIP prime, if you are engaging in inquiry aimed at figure out Q, then you ought to take the necessary means figuring out Q, will come in conflict with our good old KPA. If one is in a position to know proposition P, then one is permitted to come to know that P in the same way in which ZIP did, right? So, I'm engaging in the inquiry now. I'm counting the windows on the Chrysler building. At the same time, I'm in a position to know, the thought goes that there's a guy leaving the central station, but I don't come to know that there's a guy leaving the central station because I'm super focused on counting the windows. So I come in conflict with KPA. That's the thought. Now, another thing that you can do is just, think that there's no normative conflict after all in the Chrysler building case. And here is why you might think that. So that's the first thought that I had when I saw this puzzle. Notice that ZIP is an obligation, while KPA is a permission, right? So ZIP tells you that you should count the windows, while KPA just tells you that you're allowed to come to know that there's a man leaving the station, right? Insofar as you're in a position to know it. So it's never the case that permissions and obligations come in conflict. Permissions don't mind if you just go with the obligation. That's by definition of permissions, right? So that's a blunder on Jane's part. So maybe we can just, exploit this blunder and just get rid of the puzzle like that. The problem is that we have reasons to believe that at least some epistemic justifiers are actually obligations, not just permissions, so that KPA should be stated as an obligation and it is plausible as an obligation. So recall sexist scientists, right? Epistemic injustice cases are paradigmatic cases in which justifiers are obligations. That's what the scientist does wrong. He doesn't take up justifiers from the environment, right? His colleague tells him that whatever P, and he doesn't take up that information. So he's justified to take it up, but in the obligation sense, not in the permission sense, because if he were only in the permission sense, then we wouldn't be able to say that he did anything wrong, right? So you might think also beyond epistemic injustice cases to other cases of epistemic normative breach, like cognitive penetration cases, right? Well, where just because, I expect you to be angry at me, now I see you as angry, even though as a matter of fact, you're quite a nice guy, right? Or belief against the evidence due to motivated reasoning. We see that a lot in our societies these days, or wishful thinking, right? All of this stuff is breach of epistemic obligation, right? So breach of justifiers that are epistemic obligations. So if that's the case, KPA can be easily rephrased as an epistemic obligation. And here it is, the puzzle is back, right? So even if, Jane's blunder almost got us off the hook, the puzzle is back in the form of an obligation with the replacement of KPA that I now dub KPB. The only difference from KPA being that now it's an ought rather than a permission. All right, so last way to go about it, deny internal harmony. So maybe one thing we can do is say, well, wait a minute, is it really true that there can't be large-scale normative conflicts within a given normative domain? So it does seem as though it often happens that we have normative conflict, right? So here's a common phenomenon in all normative domains. I promise to come to lunch at 12, moral obligation to come to lunch at 12, thereby ensues. I encounter a drowning child on the way, thereby I have a moral obligation to save it, right? So there you go, it's the classic case of normative conflict, and nobody comes and says that the moral domain is peppered with conflict, therefore it is inconsistent. No, it is a classic case of overriding norms, right? So if that's the case, and if we have all these amounts of work on normative overriding, on weighing reasons and so on, why would we be so concerned about this kind of normative conflicts in the epistemic domain? Well, the problem with this response is that that's exactly the issue. In Friedman's puzzle, is not clear which one is the overriding norm and why, right? I mean, it seems intuitive that it's fine to continue counting those windows, right? There's nothing wrong with that. And that you're not doing anything wrong by ignoring the guy that's leaving the station, by not forming beliefs about him, right? So probably zip is the overriding norm, but how can we explain that? That's exactly the interesting question. Why is it that we're allowed to continue counting those windows? So if anything, that's the issue, right? That's the question. If we answer that KPB is what takes precedence, it seems that inquiry into specific questions is generally impermissible. So we don't want that result. We want to be able to count those windows, right? But if we answer that it's zip that takes precedence, we need to explain why. So in a nutshell, we get the Friedman puzzle back again. It's an epistemic dilemma this time around. Should we go with zip or with KPB? So here's the revamped version. We have epistemic norms are zetetic norms. We have zetetic norms and epistemic norms lead to normative dilemmas this time around. There cannot be large-scale dilemmas within a given normative domain, and we get a new puzzle. And this also seems much more plausible if you look at the third claim. Indeed, normative conflict is one thing, but a normative domain peppered with dilemmas, that's maybe harder to swallow. So now, how about going social first rather than individual first? So I told you earlier that there are these nice people who thought that the social environment is what we should start our analysis with. So Sandy Goldberg does something like that, and his work can be seen, can be read as denying internal harmony, right? So Sandy says that social expectations ground epistemic norms, right? So the reason why, you should believe that there's a computer in front of you right now, according to Sandy's view, is because there's a social expectation that when, there's a computer in front of you and there's nothing blocking your view and so on, you should believe it. So that's what grounds that epistemic norm, according to Sandy. So according to him, that's why we think that the sexist scientist and Dr. X are doing something epistemically wrong, because we socially expect them to do otherwise, right? We socially expect the sexist scientist to believe his woman colleague. We socially expect the doctor to keep up with the recent developments in his field, but they both fail to do so. And that's why they're epistemically in breach of norm. And Sandy, may continue saying, well, social expectations often face us with dilemmas, right? There's not very strange, right? That can be dilemmatic normative conflicts within a given normative domain. The social domain is a case in point. Now, the problem, as I said earlier, is that there are epistemically legitimate and epistemically illegitimate social expectations. Remember the case of epistemic injustice again. There are societies where you are not expected to believe women because they're expected to not be particularly bright, right? So that's a social expectation that's not fantastic for grounding our epistemic normativity, right? Another problem with this view is that social expectations about inquiry are going to be epistemically irrelevant versus social expectations in inquiry, right? So there's going to be social expectations like, you know, my father wants me to study biology because he's a famous biologist and he wants me to, you know, follow in his lead. That's a social expectation about inquiry, but that doesn't deliver any epistemic norms. It's not the case that if I don't go to biology school, I'm in breach of my epistemic norms. So again, the difference between about inquiry and within inquiry when it comes to normativity is very hard to track if you have Sandy's view. Whew. So close to the end, here is my true solution. So what I want to press on you is that if we start with knowledge, life is beautiful and easy. All of a sudden, all puzzles disappear. that's the message. So recall Friedman's puzzle, right? At least the more refined version, more kind of plausible version that we arrived at, right? Epistemic norms are zetetic norms. Zetetic norms and epistemic norms lead to normative dilemmas on a large scale, and that's unacceptable for a normative domain. My way is to deny easy conflict, deny two. I don't think that zetetic norms and epistemic norms lead to normative dilemmas on a large scale. And here is why. Remember ZIP and KPB, right? So my claim is that there is no conflict between ZIP prime and KPB, even though they're both obligations. Remember that we rephrase KPA to make it into an obligation. So here is why. So on my account, being in a position to know implies easy epistemic availability, right? So I'm not in a position to know all arithmetical truths. I really am not. I wish I were. And you know, they do follow from Peano axioms, and I know Peano axioms. So in principle, I have epistemically all I need to come to know all arithmetical truths. But I want to say I'm not in a position to know all arithmetical truths. And why is that? Well, I'm cognitively limited. So that's unfortunate, right? So if this kind of cognitive availability kind of, you know, limits what I am in a position to know, then I just don't get the Friedman puzzle. That's the claim. So here is why. So I think that these limitations, if we look closely at them, they come in kinds, right? These limitations of what I can do with my head and, you know, consequently on being in a position to know. So there are qualitative limitations, right? So, you know, there's types of information that a cognizer of my type can't process. For instance, what my friend in Australia is having for breakfast right now is a type of information that I can't process unless, you know, I call her or something, because I have these physical limitations. I can't, you know, teleport myself to Australia and see what she's eating. There are quantitative limitations as well. I don't know about the arithmetical case. It's probably a combination of qualitative and quantitative. I think it's also the type of information that I can't process, not just the quantity. But even if it were if arithmetics, you know, was super easy, the entire body of work in arithmetics was super easy, it would still be impossible for me to, you know, come to know all that stuff because it's just too much stuff, right? So I'm not in a position to know all of that stuff. I'm not in a position to know, you know, the number of grains of sand on the beach and so on. It's just too much for me to process. And then there are environmental limitations on what I can do with my head again. So, you know, there are environmental limitations in the sense in which the laws of nature and social norms limit the kind of stuff that I am in a position to know, right? So because of the laws of nature, I am in a position to know that there are crocodiles in the lake, right? Because of the way in which laws of nature are, I should go and check whether there are crocodiles in the lake in particular parts of the world. If there are crocodiles in my fridge, I'm not in a position to know that because my social and physical environment is such that it's not my job to search for crocodiles in the fridge. So if they happen to be there, I'm not in a position to know. Similarly, if there's a letter on the table where, you know, you write to me and you tell me that you got married, I'm in a position to know that. If you put the letter under the doormat in front of my house, I'm not in a position to know that you got married because I'm not going to check for under the doormat for letters. That's just how my social environment is structured. You don't put letters under the doormat. So in a nutshell, here's what I think being in a position to know is. So S is in a position to know a fact F if and only if S has a cognitive process with a function of generating knowledge that can in the senses that I described, qualitatively, quantitatively, and environmentally, easily uptake F in cognizers of S's type, right? So this is a lot of talk for nothing. All I'm saying is, in order to be in a position to know something, it needs to be the case that you have a cognitive process that can uptake it. That's all this definition says. It's nothing really fancy. And this can is described in the ways in which we just discussed, right? What's important about this definition to notice is that this can, so it is an ought implies can, but it is a restricted version thereof. It is not an ought implies I can. It is an ought implies people like me can, cognizers of my type. And that's for the reason that the sexist scientist can be argued not to be able to believe the woman because he's so sexist. Bias just doesn't permit him, right? It makes him, incapable to believe her. But he definitely has the cognitive apparatus to believe her because cognizers of his type do have that cognitive apparatus. So that's why it's a restricted version of what implies can that I have here. All right. So in previous work, I argued that pieces of evidence are knowledge indicators and defeaters are ignorance indicators. Again, there's not much to this. All that means is that these are probability raisers or probability lowerers, as it were, that I'm in a position to know, right? So a piece of evidence that supports P is a fact that raises the probability of P and that I'm in a position to know. And conversely, a defeater for P is a fact that lowers the probability for P and I'm in a position to know. So options of my view. First, we get the result that the sexist scientist is unjustified. Why is that? Well, he is in a position to know from his colleagues' testimony, which cognizers like him can easily uptake, right, with their knowledge-generating cognitive processes, that his experiment was flawed. So that's why he's unjustified in his belief, in his suspension. And this fact, the testimony of his colleague, does lower the probability that P, right? So I get the result that he's unjustified. Dr. X is also unjustified. Why? Because cognizers like him, doctors, are in a position to know widely available research results in the field, like, for instance, the fact that ulcers are caused by bacteria, right? Again, this fact does lower the evidential probability that they're caused by stress. Therefore, I get the result that Dr. X is unjustified. And finally, what we were after, we get no normative conflict in the Friedman puzzle. And here is why. We're cognitively limited cognizers. We have quantitative limitations on being in a position to know, right? And this imply the denial of conjunction introduction. So if you have quantitative limitations, what that means is that you're going to have cases in which you're in a position to know that P, you're in a position to know that Q, and you're in a position to know that R, but you're not in a position to know that P and Q and R because that's just too hard. So you can know them separately, but you can't know them all at the same time. You can't know the conjunction is just too long a conjunction, too hard to process, right? So that means that conjunction introduction doesn't hold, on my view, for being in a position to know. And that seems right. I mean, it seems to be the case with action as well. I might be in a position to cook dinner and in a position to give a talk, but I'm not in a position to do both at the same time, right? So that seems right. And if I deny conjunction introduction, what I get is the result that I'm not in a position to know a bunch of facts around me while I'm counting the windows on the Chrysler building. I'm in a position to either know how many windows there are on the Chrysler building, or to know all of the other stuff that's happening around me, that there's a man exiting the station, that there's a child playing in front of it, but I'm not in a position to know them at the same time because I'm too cognitively limited. I either count the windows or I look at the man exiting the station. But since that's the case, so since I'm in a position to know them separately, but never at the same time, and since epistemic obligations, by my view, are grounded in being in a position to know, I am never subject to these two epistemic obligations at the same time. So I'm never subject to a conjunctive obligation. I'm only subject to one or the other. So if I started counting the windows, now I am subject to the obligation to find out how many there are, and I'm not subject to the obligation to come to believe anything about the man who leaves the station. If I haven't started counting the windows, I am now under an obligation to come to believe some of the stuff that's happening around me. And you might wonder, well, great, but how does anybody ever start to count windows then, right? I mean, I am now in front of the central station. I'm under an obligation to start forming beliefs about all kind of people exiting the station and so on. How do I start ever counting those windows? Because I'm busy forming beliefs. Well, that's easy. Practical normativity, I'm sorry to say, it's always said for an epistemologist to say this, always overrides epistemic normativity. If I have practical interest to count those windows, practical normativity is going to override my epistemic obligation to form beliefs about who exits the station. And it's going to make it such that it is, all things considered, permissible for me to start counting. Practically and all things considered, not epistemically. But as soon as I do start counting, because of this practical normativity that allows me to do so, as soon as I do start counting, the epistemic obligation to continue also steps in. So as soon as I started, I'm also epistemically obliged to do so. In a nutshell, no conjunctive obligation implies no epistemic dilemma. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Mona, for a fantastic talk. I'm sure everyone's joining me in using the applause button, even if digitally. Had this been in a live hall, this would have been astounding. And thank you again to Professor Simion. If you'd like to ask a question, please make yourselves known in chat or viva voce. This would be an ideal time to do so. We have Dr. Dan Zeman. Dan, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot, Mona. So, as you know, I'm not. You hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. I'm far away from knowing anything about anything substantial about epistemology. But maybe I'm just agreeing with you, because this kind of like practical stuff that you said at the end, that seems to me crucial. But I think I'm kind of not like seeing the force of the puzzle, in the sense that, like, you know, for the puzzle to arise, it seems to me that everything that has to do with the subject matter, that, you know, that the subject that the knowledge thing is about, has somehow been taken out of the picture. And so to exemplify that is, you know, going back to your example, I wanna count the windows of the Chrysler building, and then, you know, there's this other belief that I'm in a position to know whatever about the person, somebody being there or something like that. Why is that an obligation in this context in which I want to number I want to count the windows? Why does it have anything to do with that person being there, or anything else having to do with my counting of the windows? That's what I don't understand. Like, why is the puzzle, unless we're talking about some beliefs maybe my jargon is off the rails here, but like, is there something that I ought to form? Are there any propositions that I have to get to know, or be in a position to know or believe, or something like that, in any context? Is that
you can make it? So I think you're right. So I think that you're latching on to the point in my talk when I said, well, these are just permissions. So why do we have the puzzle to begin with? But it is intuitive that once in a while we encounter obligations like this, right? So, you know, imagine someone who doesn't believe in climate change. And when you ask them, why do you not believe in climate change? They tell you, well, because whenever there's discussion of climate change on TV, I'm really busy counting the windows on the Chrysler building. I mean, you know, that's one case of an epistemic dilemma there. You might think that the guy intuitively at some point has the obligation to stop counting those windows and listen to the news about climate change. And similarly, you know, the sexy scientists can say, yeah, I never listen to women because as soon as they start to speak, I start to count the windows on the Chrysler building. So, you know, you don't want that to come out as fine and permissible. So you don't want that reply to be a good one, basically.
Right, but I'm not sure I mean, so, right, of course. But the point is that, well, assuming that I have this epistemic goal, right, to count or whatever, this goal of inquiry, to count the windows. Sorry that I jumped directly to another reply. Okay. So then some issues in that context, I can like safely ignore, as it were. including like global warming. Let's say if it doesn't affect my counting of the windows, maybe it does in some ways. But I mean, I could safely ignore it. I don't think that's true for the sexist scientists, because they have to, their goal is to find out the truth about whatever causes ulcer, and then of course not listening to women or not reading whatever relevant study, that obviously goes against that goal. So I think that could be, or maybe this is a problematic thing, but you can make a difference between like things that are relevant to an issue or things that are not relevant to an issue.
Yeah, so you can, yeah, exactly, as you well point out, the difficulty is basically making the difference between things that you should focus on and things that you shouldn't. That's the difficulty indeed. So, you can go by goal. So you can say, well, what matters is the goal. The sexist scientist should listen to the woman because it's relevant to his goal of whatever, finding out whatever he's researching. The doctor should read his whatever new studies about ulcer because it's relevant to his goal to whatever know about medicine. But I don't have to, listen to the latest music on MTV when I'm busy counting the windows on the Chrysler building. I really, that's fine. But the problem is making the difference between the things that are relevant, the things that aren't, because the goal is not going to cut it. Again, you can't excuse the climate denialist by just saying, well, he's never had the goal to find out about it. Therefore, he is perfectly fine in his denial. Similarly, you can't excuse, half of the population of Romania for not knowing about vaccines because they just never had the goal to find out about them. So that it can't be just the goal that makes the difference. It needs to be something else. It needs to be the case that there are goals that you should have, as it were. You see what I mean? So the goal of finding out about climate change is a goal that you should have, even if you don't have. And that's that we're looking for here. So
I guess that's what sorry again, Andrei. I guess that's what I was asking. Like, is there any ought that we have in this sense, in understanding, like any proposition or knowledge that we ought to have in any context? But then obviously, if you have to have it in any context, then it kind of trumps anything else in a way.
Yeah, so that's basically what
there
I'm
such a thing?
to do. Yeah, sorry, that's what I'm trying to do in the talk, to ground this should, to basically explain when it is that you should listen to, the news about climate science and when it is that you shouldn't, and why it is fine if you started counting the windows, to continue counting the windows, and why in some cases it's not, because practical considerations are going to override. So if you're asking me on my account why it's not okay for the climate denialist to keep saying that he's counting the windows and that's why he's not listening to the news, my response is going to be, well, it's not practically okay. So there are practical considerations for which he should stop counting those windows and start watching TV. But as soon as he does start watching TV, then he has epistemic obligations to believe, what the evidence suggests about climate change.
Okay, thanks. Excellent. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Don and Mona, for answering. Next up, we have Cătălin. Cătălin Teuhage is a master's student with us, and he's quite astute. He's a fantastic conversational partner. Cătălin, go ahead.
Thank you, Andrei, for this too nice introduction of myself. And thank you, Mona, for the great lecture. So I have one observation and one question. So the observation is that I think your solution is very strong by pointing that being in position to know P, Q, R, etc. doesn't make you in position to know all of them, right? So I think this is a very strong argument to show that actually this is no conflict, right? At the same time, I also thought that there is very strong argument, I think it was point 2 in your presentation, which is there is a distinction between ZIP being on obligation and KPA being permission. And then you moved it then to KPB, and I would like you, if you can explain a bit more about, again, how was that done? Because I thought it's unnecessary, but you've said it's necessary, so please, if you can re-explain.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. Yeah, so indeed, so what Jane does in the paper is she starts with KPA, which indeed is a permission. So de facto, she finds no conflict. I think that's just a blunder. In her defense, one section later, she thinks, well, how about if we state this as an obligation? And then she comes and says, yeah, but many people think that epistemic norms are not obligations, so that's not a problem, or something like that. And indeed, that's a very kind of big debate in epistemology whether there are epistemic obligations or not. Many people, the old shape of the debate was people thought, well, obligations imply control. You can't be obliged to FI if it's out of your control. And voluntarism about belief is false. Beliefs are not under our control. Therefore, how can it be that we have any obligations about them? That's an old debate with old assumptions. In the meantime, we figured out that, we have obligations even if it's not under our control. So for instance, the case of sexist bias or racist bias is the case in point, right? It's not under my control by the definition of bias, but that doesn't mean it's fine. I am under an obligation not to have it, even though it's not under my control. So that's why ought implies can is not very fashionable, at least not in a totally unrestricted shape these days. So that's why I said, well, yes, we can escape the puzzle by just saying, well, KPA is a permission, ZIP is an obligation, there is no puzzle, goodbye. But as a matter of fact, we can also just save the puzzle. So Jane Friedman can just come back and say, well, actually, let's just state this KPA as an obligation. Let's call it KPB and state it as an obligation, and the puzzle resurfaces. And the reason why we can plausibly state it as an obligation is indeed because it does look as though in cases like cases of epistemic injustice and the cases like the doctor with the ulcer and so on, you're epistemically obliged to find that stuff out. And indeed, that makes it such that it is plausible to state KP as an obligation. And as soon as it is an obligation, it does come in conflict with ZIP, because two obligations can come in conflict. So that's kind of the step in the argument. The step is, yeah, we can escape the puzzle like that, but it's just going to come back to haunt us in a new form. So life is not as easy as we thought, basically.
So then putting the two things that I mentioned together, if KPB is true, then does not make also then we have to know P, we have to know Q, we have to know R, then you have to know the conjunction in the end.
No, it doesn't. So the fact that there are epistemic obligations, it doesn't follow that they're also closed under conjunction. So you can accept that there are epistemic obligations without accepting that they are closed under conjunctions. Just like you can accept that there are practical obligations, like the example that I just gave. I might have the practical obligation to cook dinner because my kids are hungry, and the practical obligation to give this talk because I promised to do so. But I can't have, the practical obligation to do both because it's humanly impossible to do both at the same time. So what's going to happen is one of them is going to have to go, and you can notice which one did. So, in the same way in which I can have two practical obligations without having the conjunctive obligation, so without having them at the same time, if you see what I mean, I can have two epistemic obligations without having them conjunctively.
Yeah, thank you, Mona.
Thanks so much, Catalina and Mona. Next up, we have Ovidio. Ovidio, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me? I guess so. Yeah, so this might be totally off topic or just trivial. I got disconnected at some point when you presented the Chrysler building thing.
Oh, so sorry.
So I was thinking, would it make any difference, for instance, if you would frame the entire puzzle, as it were, as if, there is this kind of positive thing, this positive right, epistemic right, just, to the right to kind of ignore stuff whenever you are setting up an epistemic goal? And would it make any difference if you would frame it as a positive thing?
That's good. That's interesting. So instead of framing it as an obligation, you're thinking,
yeah, I mean, I have the right now because I have this, I set up my goal, this goal of counting the windows. Now I have the right to kind of ignore the people getting out of the train station or whatever.
Yeah, and then you want to say, well, you have this right, and then you also have the right to just sit there and look at people leaving the station.
Yeah, and that's kind of pragmatically, up to you.
And the question is, how do these kind of rights come in conflict, and how is it?
Would this make any difference in the?
Yeah, that's good. That's interesting. I mean, one thing that's happening is that you would have to say that there's some obligation to come to believe stuff about the people who leave the station in order for something to come in conflict with your right to continue counting. So either you either need to say that you also have the right to form beliefs about people leaving the station, or you have to say that you have to form these beliefs because they're right in front of you and it's epistemically crazy not to, because otherwise you don't get the puzzle going, basically. But if you want to say, well, actually, it is within my right, as soon as I started an inquiry, to continue it and ignore everything else that's happening, what your view is, basically, is that there are no epistemic obligations to do anything else in terms of inquiry other than what you set out to do.
Yeah, of course, minus some like obvious things, someone coming out with a knife or something like that.
Yeah, so that's if you want to say that, you're going to be in a situation that we were discussing before with Dan, where the question is going to be, why do we think that the climate...
That's denying the puzzle, basically.
Yeah. So basically, if climate denialists are within their right to count windows on the Chrysler building whenever they...
Yeah, but they would have to have like a goal to justify their kind of denying.
So my most important goal in life is to count the windows on the Chrysler building. And now, climate change is happening around me, COVID and all of that, but my goal remains to count the windows on the Chrysler building. It still doesn't seem epistemically permissible to be a climate denialist just because that's my goal, to count the windows. So that's a thing that you must be able to explain. Now, again, maybe in a rights framework, you can still explain it with practical consideration. So maybe it's not within your right because, it's practically bad for so many other people. So you're infringing on other people's rights by ignoring this news about climate and COVID. Maybe you can do it like that. So if you want to give a rights-based kind of response to Friedman, you can do a thing whereby, look, I have the right because I set up this goal, but it's overridable, like all rights, by other people's rights, right? So the freedom of speech is also like that. It's a right that I have only insofar as it doesn't infringe on other people's well-being and so on, right? So I think it can be actually unpacked in a rights framework. You might want to try it.
Oh,
I think it might work, yeah.
Cool, thanks. I do have one other small question, may I? Right, so on your account, say the sexist scientist, right? So you want to claim he's unjustified, and basically the way you to test this is like if cognizers like him kind of are in a position to know that you should account for evidence. I mean, whenever it's coming from and so on. But I mean, how do you evaluate this like him? Is this kind of
that's
relative to social epistemic norms?
I don't have much to say about. So I'm going to have to leave it as a primitive, because obviously I'm going to have a generality problem. So I don't want to go very narrow, because if you go very narrow, cognizers like him are going to be biased sexist cognizers. We don't want that, right? And if you go too broad, you don't want to say any person with with a brain, because then I mean you
lose the social thing.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I'm saying I'm going to have a generality problem. I'm going to have to leave this as a primitive. And all I want to say is, look, it's the intuitive thought that he's an adult human cognizer that is able to, form beliefs based on women's testimony. If all else, absent, i.e. bias is absent and so on. Now, there's an entire discussion in ethics that you might maybe know better than me about limitations on what implies can. So I read a paper. So I was for the longest time convinced that the correct version is this version that I endorse in this paper, where it's not restricted to individuals, but it is restricted to types of individuals. And I've seen a paper now that suggests that even this is false. Can't even be restricted to types of individuals. So consider a case in which you are an exceptional mathematician. You're weird, right? So you're not a normal cognizer of your type. And now you can save the life of a child by doing a very complicated mathematical calculation that none of us can do. So on an account that restricts the types of cognizers, what obligations you have, now it's going to turn out you have absolutely no obligation to save that child, and that's obviously false. So you know, I'm now in a situation where I think that ought implies can, the only plausible maybe version is the disjunctive thing, whereby you ought just in case a cognizer of your type can, or you can, or something like that. Very ugly disjunctive stuff. But yeah, you're totally right. It's going to have to be very vague what I mean by cognizer of your type. I'm going to have to leave it intuitive and primitive. Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
All right, thanks so much, Ovidiu. The list of questions is exhausted, so I'm going to take the opportunity to ask, well, a disjunctive question of my own. And so I thought, you know, all of this is half-baked, all of this is unclear to me, and I'm sure it's going to be way too unclear to anyone else. But I have 3 questions, okay? And I'm going to let you choose which one you want to answer, okay? So the first question is this. I very much wish I were a knowledge first person, but I guess for the time being, I'm not. So there's this age-old distinction, debate about the difference between the context of discovery and the context of justification. And there it seems as though it's quite natural. It goes without saying that a bunch of the norms that apply to inquiry are going to be different from a bunch of the norms that apply to the ensuing knowledge. And so it just seems as though it's a matter of course, there's no problem. So for instance, to the extent that this counts as a case of knowledge, and it might not, say when Lavoisier invented the concept of oxygen, right, quarreling with Priestley, and it might have been that throughout the discovery of this, throughout the conceptual articulation of the concept of oxygen, coherence was a guiding norm. And he wanted to say phenomena, and perhaps empirical adequacy was also a guiding norm. But in retrospect, when we want to be able to justify what Lavoisier was doing, perhaps accuracy, truth, is what counts most, right? Rather than coherence or empirical adequacy. So it seems as though there's quite this kind of disconnect. And I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying perhaps prima facie, there's a case to be made for that. Anyway, so that was the first of the 3 questions.
Can I answer it? I tend to forget them when you ask me more than once. So can I answer it?
Yeah, sure.
And then we can, if there's still time, I can move on to the next. So I don't defend the view that zetetic norms and epistemic norms are identical. I think there are zetetic norms that are not epistemic norms. I don't think, though, that the other way around holds. So I think all epistemic norms are zetetic norms, but some zetetic norms are not epistemic. So for instance, the practical norm that says, go and count the windows on the Chrysler building because you need to know the number to put it in your whatever construction permit or whatever, that's not an epistemic norm. That's a practical norm. So that's one thing. And of course, that's gonna, on my account, make the difference between proper, context of justification type normativity and context of discovery type normativity, right? So you're gonna think, well, did they do well that they went by coherence? Well, it depends what the coherence was with. If the coherence was with a bunch of falsehoods, then we're gonna say, no, they did not. They shouldn't have done that. Or if you're a coherentist about justification, we're gonna think, yeah, of course they should have done that. I don't even care that it was true or false. It's good that they went by the coherence principle. But in a nutshell, yes, it's important to know that I don't take, all zetetic norms to be epistemic norms. Indeed, the case of go to biology school in order to become a biologist like your daddy, it's the kind of, zetetic norm that's not an epistemic norm, I take it. The difficulty is for most of us, and I think that this is a difficulty that Sandy Goldberg has been trying to solve for a very long time, is to figure out the difference between zetetic norms and epistemic zetetic norms, as it were. So zetetic norms that are epistemic, zetetic norms that are not. And that's what Sandy tries to do with that social expectation type of thing and fails. And my view tries to say that basically epistemic norms are the zetetic norms that are delivered by being in a position to know. So whenever you're in a position to know something, you ought to know it. And that ought is an ought of inquiry, but also an ought, an epistemic ought. If you're not in a position to know it, where, you know, the way in which I unpacked being in a position to know includes all those limitations, then you may still be obliged to go and find it out by some practical concern. So I'm not in a position to know now if any letter has arrived at my door, because I don't have, you know, availability right now. I'm too limited to see whether there's a letter in front of my door. But there may be practical, you know, norms that tell me that I should go and find out, and it's not very hard to go and find out. And then there are going to be limitations even on the practical considerations, of course, because if you tell me that I have a practical obligation to fly to Australia and find out immediately whether my, you know, friend is eating eggs right now, that's not a practical obligation that I can have, because it's just too hard for people like me. So that's roughly what I want to say, that there is a difference indeed between context of justification, context of discovery. And the difference for me is between what you're in a position to know and what you're not in a position to know. And just to add, you should be a knowledge person.
Well, okay, then I'm going to drop my other questions, and I'm just going to try to ask a quick follow-up to this, and I'm going to ask the chair for permission, and permission granted. Well, wouldn't discovery and justification count as, I'm not even sure exactly how to phrase this, but distinct dimensions of epistemic evaluation? Why would we need to count them and to appraise them in terms of knowledge? And why would one of them sort of disqualify and the other sort of qualify? What's wrong with discovery, right?
Nothing wrong with discovery, nothing at all. It's just that, so the way I see it is, you know, all this epistemic normativity is there to ensure that you reliably gain knowledge in your epistemic endeavors. Just like, you know, norms of chess are there to ensure that you're reaching the aim of chess, whichever it may be. Checkmate, I guess. In that way, knowledge, if you want, if you're engaged in this kind of, if you're engaged in an inquiry and you're governed by these norms, is a bit inescapable. You can't really choose not to care about it, in the way in which you can't really choose not to care about the goal of chess when you play chess. You can't choose to want to do something completely different with those pieces, because other than, you know, whatever the norms say, because if you just take all the chess pieces and throw them in the air 3 times, you don't really count as playing chess. In the same way, if you don't care about acquiring knowledge when you're evaluating evidence, you don't really count as being involved in an epistemic practice. So, you know, you need to, so these norms are governing you whether you want or not, insofar as you're engaged in the practice. Context of discovery is not like that. You can choose not to engage, right? In the same way in which I can choose not to play chess at all, and then I'm not governed by those norms. So that's the difference. The difference is that as soon as I engage in the activity, then I'm, you know, governed by these norms whether I wish to be or not. So, you know, you can choose to be governed by the knowledge norm in all walks of life. That's a very hardcore form of knowledge first. You know, knowledge first account of how to lead your life, but but you don't have to.
Right. That's fantastic. That's definitely the reply I was looking for. I just thought I'd mention an anecdote, and maybe it's relevant, maybe it's not. I think it's not, but it seems sort of prima facie germane. So Mikhail Tal, right, famous chess champion, right, an Estonian guy, recounts how when he was a kid, he used to get beaten up in chess by all the other kids. And then he started doing these kind of fantastic combinations And after a while, I think that lasted for a couple of years. After a while, he started winning. Okay, so what's going on here? We have a discovery setting, right, where he's utterly unreliable for a couple of years, right, or at least a couple of months. Okay, and then he becomes this kind of huge figure. Okay, this kind of world chess champion. His games are a beauty. They're just so lovely to watch. Okay, but this is all after the fact, right? So what happens in these months? What happens in these 1 or 2 or 3 years, right? He's utterly unreliable. He's going against the grain, right? But at the end of it all, he seems to be sort of, well, I mean, it's quite special. So yeah.
Let's hope that that's what's gonna happen with our climate deniers and and the vaccine deniers as well. Maybe they just, you know, go all crazed up about epistemic ways, and 4 years from now they're gonna discover these fantastic ways of treating COVID.
Yeah. I'm just defending Mikhail Tal, just for the record. I'm not any of those guys, but anyway. Okay, so that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Mona. This has been a fantastic talk, a beautiful talk. We're very much appreciated. I'm again going to use this worn out digital applause button, but we very much appreciate it. And
thank you for the fantastic questions. It was very much fun indeed.
And please join us again as soon as possible.
Will do. Pa,
Good night. Take care.
See you. Bye.
Ciao.